First tonight, the intelligence services in the Netherlands and Germany have accused Russia of increasingly using chemical weapons in Ukraine. They say Russia is deploying tear gas and a stronger chemical choking agent known as chloropicrin, which it drops from drones to flush Ukrainian soldiers out of trenches so they can be shot. Moscow denies the claims. Meanwhile, President Zelensky has denounced Russia after it targeted Ukraine with the biggest overnight bombardment of the war to date. The huge barrage targeted Kyiv and other parts of the country. The scene in the capital has been described as like something from Armageddon. President Zelensky is calling for further sanctions on Moscow to stop the destruction, which has come just 2 days after the US announced it was suspending the supply of some critical weapons to Kyiv. President Trump spoke at length with Vladimir Putin on Thursday, but it hasn't stopped the bombs from falling.
For Russia and Ukraine, are you speaking to Zelensky tomorrow? And what are you hoping
I'm speaking to President Zelensky tomorrow, early in the morning, and I'm very disappointed with the conversation I had today with President Putin, because I don't think he's there. I don't think he's there, and I'm very disappointed. Well, it's not, I'm just saying, I don't think he's looking to stop, and that's too bad. This is Biden. This isn't me. This is Biden's war. It wouldn't have happened if I were president. It wouldn't have happened. So, in one way I had to get too involved because it's Biden's war. And I got stuck in the middle of it, just like I did with immigration and a lot of other things that they screwed up. But I was not happy with the conversation, no.
President Trump. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from London by the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Dr. Laskiewicz, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's start with the most recent attack on Ukraine by the Russians. Wave after wave of drones said to have been launched on Kyiv. And this is now a familiar story for Ukrainians, isn't it?
Yes, it is, because it's quite clear that what President Putin is aiming for is simply to sap the determination of the Ukrainian people to carry on. There was recently a poll carried out which showed that 53% of Ukrainians were ready to sign a compromise deal, and they don't see the recovery of all the land which President Putin has occupied as being possible or necessary. And these constant attacks do sap the will of the population. It has to be said, in all honesty, sapping does not actually has ever led to victory. London survived the Blitz. Warsaw fought on despite being bombed by the Germans. Berlin fought to the end. But per se, bombing doesn't do it, but it adds to the pressure on President Zelensky and to the pressure on the Ukrainians.
Absolutely it does. And Russia, of course, insisting that it's attacking only military targets, but the wreckage of residential apartment blocks suggesting otherwise.
Oh, yes. To be quite honest, you have to take very, very carefully, a pinch of salt is putting it mildly, anything that Russia says. The facts are quite clear. They are hammering Kyiv, especially because it's the capital city, of course, and other places as well, in an effort to break morale. And the business of them attacking military targets is so much hogwash. Here and there, quite possibly, they may also be doing that, but it's by no means the primary target.
And I mean, do you think Ukraine is losing its ability to defend itself? Because, I mean, we've seen not just this latest attack, but there's been a whole series of very large-scale aerial bombardments in recent weeks, with the number of drones used continuing to go up. I mean, has Ukraine maintained its ability to combat these threats?
On the whole, it's still containing them to some degree, but I would say the situation is worse now than it was. The fact of the matter is, all this rubbish talked about Russia being on the way out and couldn't afford the war and so on has been shown out to be just that. The key point you've mentioned here is, of course, that they're increasing the number of missiles and drones they're using. And therefore, in this respect, Ukraine, slowly but surely, I think, is losing this war of attrition. And winning wars by attrition is a war-winning strategy like any other. And this is what appears to be Russia's tactic. The business of chemical weapons is interesting because it all depends whether they're using chemicals which are banned or not. The interesting one is tear gas, for example. As far as I know, that's not banned. And so it would have to be looked at more carefully exactly which ones they're using before a formal accusation is made.
Well, I'm going to come back to that in a minute because that's an important point that you raise. But just returning to these massive barrages and bombardments, President Trump has also indicated that the US may well be cutting key anti-missile defense supplies to Ukraine. President Zelensky is hoping to speak to Mr. Trump tonight. The conversation may already be underway. Is there anything he can say that may change the president's mind as that US support continues to ebb away?
Well, to be quite honest, he said everything. And what he has said to date doesn't impress Donald Trump. Therein lies the problem. That's why Donald Trump is withdrawing troops. In Donald Trump's defense, it has to be said that Poland's another country where it has been pointed out they've supplied Ukraine to the detriment of their own forces, to the point where they themselves are worried about their own defense. Secondly, Donald Trump, there is a financial aspect to supplying Ukraine, and he has to also bear that in mind, especially as his budget will greatly increase the American debt. So therefore, he has to note those points. But unquestionably, President Zelensky is right that if Donald Trump does withdraw it, Ukraine will find itself in a very sticky situation. It is, in fact, because President Zelensky I think, been approached the war differently some time back, in also about how many arms he wants, how much arms he wants, that would have helped him now. But as it stands, quite clearly, on top of any rational points that I've made, Donald Trump has simply had enough, one has the impression. He is, however, and this is the key point for President Zelensky, absolutely crucial. He did have a bad conversation with President Putin. And so to answer your question, yes, he would have to emphasize that conversation with President Putin.
And let's return to that topic of chemical weapons that you were talking about. Russia now accused of increasingly using such weapons in Ukraine, and by the Dutch and German intelligence agencies. They're the ones who are leveling the latest accusations. What more are you hearing about that?
This is the key aspect. There's three elements to this. First of all, are the chemical weapons seen as being normal conventional ones to some degree, or part of the banned weapons, which are therefore akin to like tactical nukes? If they are the former, then in fact they're just an escalation of the war, but in its way quite normal, in the sense that if assuming that the chemicals can be used. I was especially interested in the use of tear gas, which is a police, please note this, a police chemical weapon, so to be said. And therefore, if they do this, I'm not sure they could be accused. I'd wait to see more on precisely what's being said here. Number two, there is an escalation, but if it includes banned chemical weapons, as which they have been previously said to have used, then that is serious. That is because that is one further escalation we do not want to see, because it goes towards non-conventional weapons, of which tactical nukes like chemical weapons are the next stage.
Well, let me just tell you that the information coming through is that, in fact, Russia, according to the Dutch intelligence agency, Russia is using prohibited chemical weapons in Ukraine. And it mentions specifically the World War I era poison gas known as chloropicrin. That is a banned chemical weapon. It's a prohibited chemical weapon. And according to the Dutch as well as the Germans, it's become standardized and commonplace, Russian military using it in Ukraine.
Yes, The key point is the odd one is the tear gas, which was also mentioned. I agree with what you said just now. The problem is the Dutch have said and the Germans, it has to see whether other countries will follow suit with this accusation. As it stands, yes, that will be one step further. The point about the tear gas is interesting, is because it's akin to depleted uranium. That was used in the Gulf War, and at the time people voiced concerns, but it's since become, if you like, a conventional weapon. And so the tear gas might be so deemed, but World War I poison gas is not. And if it can be demonstrated to be used on a regular basis, then there is some the radial cause of concern, but that will certainly be a step upwards. But what's interesting about it is, it's by no means the only chemical gas, and if they can use prohibited chemicals, there's a lot more they could use, far deadlier. So in this respect, although it may be prohibited, there are far worse gases around, and therefore I would like to see more investigation on this point.
Well, I think that from what I'm reading, that they're saying that chloropicrin is absolutely lethal when you are in an enclosed space, such as a trench. And what they do is that they use drones to drop them into those trenches. And then those who are running out to escape it, they get, shot.
Oh yes, you're quite right. The point I'm making is it's an old gas. You said it's World War I. And there are far worse ones around. And my impression is, especially with the tear gas, is the Russians will be treating this, or hope to treat this, like depleted uranium. Because again, uranium conjures up visions of a nuclear war. Depleted uranium is supposed to be okay in conventional weapons. So yet this is going to be, it's a developing scenario. It's a very interesting and of course worrying accusation. And I'm interested to see how the Russians, if they are caught on this, what their points will be.
Well, I mean, the Russians had previously said that the allegations are baseless. There hasn't been any immediate reaction yet to these latest allegations, but they have said in the past, when accusations like that were made, that they were baseless. But of course, just to emphasize the point, for the sake of our audience, using chemical weapons is against international law. What do you think is likely to happen in response to what the Dutch and the Germans allege is an infringement of this, especially given that Russia is a signatory to the Chemical Weapons Convention, which prohibits the use of such weapons?
Well, there's three aspects to this. First and foremost, I'm very surprised Ukraine hasn't done more in this respect and shown, its corpses, which that was what they're going to be, of soldiers affected by this gas, because it can be medically checked that they inhaled such gas. Number two, being an old gas, there are actually defenses to it, which is, again, surprising by Ukraine. Considering that the Dutch and Germans have stated it's of constant use, have not yet employed these tactics, because I repeat, there are far worse gases around. This is a pretty primitive one. And thirdly, I repeat, it all depends how far you say it's a chemical weapon, is a chemical weapon which is banned and not. That's why the tear gas was so interesting and so on. I would think this is going to run and run, in the sense it's not going to go away, but it's still not absolutely clear how far the situation goes. We need Ukraine to confirm all this. We need to see why Ukraine hasn't taken the most simple, obvious steps of defending against this. And we also have to have it confirmed that the Russians see this as a prohibited gas.
Indeed, and the point you were making, I mean, even if they're using things like tear gas, I mean, tear gas can be quite lethal when you're in an enclosed space. And the whole idea, from what I understand, is that they basically toss them in there so they can run out and get shot. But all this, Dr. Laskiewicz, appears to underline that Vladimir Putin, who spoke at length to Donald Trump, I believe it was yesterday or Thursday, is not serious about ending this war. And judging by Mr. Trump's tone after that call, do you get the sense that he seems to be losing patience with Mr. Putin?
I think Donald Trump used the exact word what he felt. He was disappointed.
Not moving.
But again, here comes a very important point. President Putin has never stated that during the negotiations, war cannot continue. So therefore, there is no actual contradiction between him seeking a peace treaty, which he likes, and carrying on the war meantime. He has never agreed to a ceasefire, does not want one. So from that point of view, it's not so much that President Putin is thumbing his nose at President Donald Trump. It's rather that he's actually doing what he did before, fighting during the negotiations until a permanent truce has been agreed. And where the problem comes as well is there is no movement on this permanent truce because, of course, Russia and Ukraine's goals are so diametrically opposed. And there's no movement from President Putin about what he wants. On the contrary, as far as I can tell, judging by his comment, the Ukrainians are really Russians, he has not budged one iota from his point that the whole of Ukraine is really a part of Russia, as it was in the USSR, as it was when he was a young man and communist Russia ruled the roost in Eastern Europe.
It is indeed a very complicated story, and I'm glad you understand it a lot better than us. You're quite good at explaining it. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the International Affairs Analyst. He was talking to me on the line from London.